It was 2 a.m. in the harsh fluorescent glow of the intensive care unit waiting room. The air smelled of industrial bleach and quiet, suffocating desperation. Through the thick glass windows of room 4B, I could see my older brother Gavin, hooked up to a terrifying array of medical machines. His skin was tinged a sickly, toxic yellow. The monitors beeped with a slow, erratic, deeply alarming rhythm. Acute liver failure, the catastrophic result of 3 years of heavy, relentless drinking after his life had completely fallen apart. His liver wasn't just failing. It was entirely, irreparably destroyed. Margot Hawthorne, my mother, was kneeling on the sterile linoleum floor in front of me. She was wearing an incredibly expensive cashmere sweater, now wrinkled and stained with tears. Her perfectly manicured hands, which usually held expensive wine glasses or country club invitations, were desperately clutching the hem of my coat. "Please, Selene," Margot sobbed, her voice a ragged, pathetic whisper that echoed in the quiet hospital wing. "Please." The doctors ran the panels. "You're a perfect match. You're the only living donor who can save him. If you don't give him a piece of your liver, he's going to die. I am begging you, he is your brother, he is family." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had given birth to me. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I felt absolutely, profoundly hollow. I felt like a ghost who had finally returned to haunt the people who had killed her. I looked at her tear-stained face, and I didn't see a grieving mother. I saw a murderer. I saw the architect of my greatest nightmare. "Family," I repeated softly, testing the word on my tongue. The word tasted like ash. I reached down, gently but firmly pried her incredibly expensive fingers off my coat, and took a deliberate step back. "I'm sorry, Margot," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, echoing the exact precise cadence she had used 3 years ago, in a much different room. "But he was never really one of mine, not my problem." Margot gasped, as if I had physically struck her across the face. She collapsed forward onto the floor, weeping hysterically, while I turned around and walked out of the hospital, leaving her to finally understand the exact, devastating price of a human life. If you want to understand how a mother can look at her dying brother and refuse to save him, you have to go back 3 years. You have to meet Lila. Lila was my daughter. She was 6 years old, with massive, bright green eyes and a laugh that could completely cure a bad day. She was the absolute center of my universe. She was a brilliant, weird little girl who loved drawing pictures of houses, but she never drew normal houses. Every single house she ever drew, no matter the color of the walls or the shape of the roof, always had a bright, sunshine yellow front door. "Why yellow, baby?" I asked her once, watching her violently scrub a yellow crayon against the paper, her tiny brow furrowed in concentration. "Because yellow means you're allowed to come inside," Lila told me seriously, as if it were a universal law of nature. When Lila was 5.5, she started getting strange bruises on her legs. Then came the fevers that wouldn't break, the bone-deep exhaustion, the nosebleeds. We spent a terrifying week running tests at the pediatric clinic before they finally gave us the diagnosis: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The diagnosis completely shattered my world. I was a single mother, working a demanding job as a financial claims specialist for a large corporate insurance firm. I read complex estate files, insurance claims, and trust documents for a living. I was good at my job, but I wasn't wealthy. I lived paycheck to paycheck, trying to provide a good life for my little girl. The standard chemotherapy protocols failed. The aggressive radiation failed. For 6 months, I watched my vibrant, energetic daughter lose her hair, lose her weight, and lose her strength. By the time Lila turned 6, her oncologist pulled me into a quiet room and told me about a revolutionary, highly experimental pediatric immunotherapy trial happening at a specialized research hospital in Boston. It was our absolute last hope. It was a miracle drug that had a staggering 70% success rate for her specific, highly aggressive genetic marker. But because it was considered experimental by the medical billing codes, my insurance flatly refused to cover a single cent of it. The cost of admission to the clinical trial was $178,000. I liquidated my incredibly meager savings. I sold my car and started taking the bus. I set up desperate, pathetic online fundraisers, begging strangers on the internet for $20 donations. I hosted bake sales. I maxed out every single credit card I possessed. I managed to raise $22,000. It wasn't even close to enough. Every day I spent trying to raise money was a day Lila's body grew weaker. Desperate, terrified, and watching my daughter slowly fade away in a sterile hospital bed, I did the one thing I had promised myself I would never do. I drove to the sprawling, highly affluent suburban estate of my parents, Margot and Russell Hawthorne. My parents were incredibly wealthy. My father ran a highly successful logistics firm, and my mother came from old, established money. But they had never liked me. From the moment I was born, I was an inconvenience. All of their love, all of their financial support, and all of their toxic enabling was entirely reserved for my older brother, Gavin, the undisputed, flawless golden child. I sat on their pristine, white, custom-upholstered living room couch. I didn't ask for a gift. I begged for a loan. I brought my financial spreadsheets. I promised to pay them back every single month for the rest of my natural life. I offered to sign away my rights to any future inheritance. "Please, Mom," I sobbed, tears streaming down my face, clutching the clinical trial brochure in my shaking hands. "It's $178,000. I know it's a lot of money. But it's Lila. It's your granddaughter. The doctors say this trial can save her. Please. I will do anything." Margot sat in her expensive leather armchair, sipping a glass of Chardonnay. She didn't look at the brochure. She looked at me with absolute clinical disdain. "Selene, you know Gavin is going through a very difficult transition right now," Margot said smoothly, referring to the fact that my 32-year-old brother had just quit his third job in 2 years because he didn't like his boss. He was currently living in a luxury apartment my parents were paying for. "Mom, Lila is dying," I gasped, unable to comprehend her callousness, my brain completely short-circuiting. "We simply don't have that kind of liquid capital available for experimental pipe dreams," as they did, taking another sip of her wine, completely unfazed by my tears. "Besides, you chose to have that child with a man who abandoned you. We warned you about him. She was never really one of ours, Selene. I'm sorry she's sick, but her medical bills are not my problem. Not my problem." My father, Russell, sat on the couch next to her. He looked at the floor. He didn't say a word. He was a weak, pathetic man who never, ever contradicted his wife, even when it meant letting his granddaughter die. I left their house completely broken, knowing that Lila's fate was sealed. 2 days later, my Aunt Lorna called me. She didn't call to ask about Lila. She called to gossip, fully aware of my financial desperation. "Did you hear the wonderful news?" Aunt Lorna chirped on the phone while I sat in the pediatric oncology ward, holding Lila's frail, bruised hand. "Your parents just bought Gavin a house. A beautiful, 4-bedroom place on Sycamore Lane, paid entirely in cash. Margot is so proud of him for finally settling down." I felt the blood completely freeze in my veins. My parents had just dropped over $400,000 in pure, liquid cash to buy my unemployed brother a luxury home, exactly 48 hours after telling me they didn't have the money to save my 6-year-old daughter's life. That weekend, while Lila was slipping into a coma, Margot hosted a massive, catered housewarming party at Gavin's new house. I saw the photos on Facebook. They were all standing in Gavin's massive, custom-built kitchen, drinking champagne, laughing. They were celebrating a house while my daughter was dying. 90 days later, the leukemia finally won. Lila passed away in my arms in a quiet hospice room. Her breathing just slowly faded away until there was nothing left. Above her bed, taped to the sterile white wall, was the last picture she ever drew. A beautiful, crooked little house with a bright, sunshine yellow door. A massive piece of my soul died that day in the hospice room. I buried my daughter in a tiny white casket. I didn't invite my parents to the funeral. I cut contact with the entire Hawthorne family and buried myself entirely in my grief and my work. I became a ghost. I worked 14 hours a day as a financial claims specialist, desperately trying to pay off the massive medical debts I had incurred during Lila's final months. I rarely slept. I rarely ate. I just worked. I was dead inside. Until a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 years after Lila's funeral. I was sitting at my cubicle, auditing a massive, highly complex batch of estate files that my firm was processing for a large wealth management bank. My job was to look for discrepancies in trust distributions and beneficiary payouts, ensuring that massive wealth transfers were legally compliant. I opened a file labeled Hawthorne, Silas, Postmortem Trust Ecutions. Silas Hawthorne was my maternal grandfather. He had died shortly before Lila was diagnosed. He was a stern, incredibly intelligent man who had built the family wealth through real estate and shrewd investments. He was the only person in the family who had ever showed me an ounce of genuine affection. The only one who didn't constantly compare me to Gavin. I stared at the screen, my heart suddenly hammering violently against my ribs. I wasn't supposed to be auditing my own family's files, but the algorithm had randomly assigned it to my queue because it was flagged for final archival. I clicked the PDF to open the primary trust document. I scrolled past the massive payouts to my mother, Margot. I scrolled past the payouts to my Aunt Lorna. And then I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The words on the screen began to violently blur as tears instantly filled my eyes. Trust for the benefit of Lila Hawthorne. My grandfather had established a highly specific, legally binding trust fund entirely in my daughter's name. I read the funding line. Initial funding amount, $214,000. I stared at the number. $214,000. It was more than enough. It was more than the $178,000 I had desperately needed for the clinical trial. My grandfather had left Lila the money to save her own life. My hands shaking violently, I scrolled down to read the fiduciary terms. Primary trustee, Margot Hawthorne. Funds to be dispersed exclusively for the medical, educational, and general welfare of the minor beneficiary. My mother was the legal guardian of the trust. She was legally bound by fiduciary duty to use that money exclusively for Lila's health, education, and welfare. I quickly pulled the attached bank ledger, tracing the financial history of the trust account, looking for the distributions. For 2 years after my grandfather's death, completely untouched, slowly accruing interest. And then I saw it. Withdrawal, March 9. 186,000 buy. Market Hawthorne, March 9. I squeezed my eyes shut, a wave of profound, suffocating nausea washing over me. March 9 was the exact week I had sat on my mother's white couch, begging her for the money for Lila's clinical trial. It was the exact week she had told me my daughter wasn't her problem. She hadn't just refused to use her own money. She had actively, maliciously withdrawn the money that legally belonged to my dying child. I immediately logged into the county public records database. I searched for property deeds under Gavin Hawthorne's name. The search result popped up instantly. Premi deed, Sycamore Lane. Purchase date, March 11. Asterisk purchase type, all cash March 11. Exactly 48 hours after Margot withdrew $186,000 from Lila's medical trust. I sat at my cubicle, staring at the screen. My mother hadn't just bought Gavin a house. She had used Lila's trust fund to pay for the massive down payment. She had literally stolen the money required to save her 6-year-old granddaughter's life, and she had used it to buy her unemployed, 32-year-old son a luxury house with a custom kitchen. They let my daughter die for a house. I didn't cry. The hollow, dead feeling that had consumed me for 3 years instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying, absolute fury. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want a tearful family reconciliation. I wanted to burn their entire lives to the absolute ground. I printed every single page of the trust document, the banking ledgers, and the county property deeds. I carefully placed the documents into a thick manila folder, my hands moving with cold, mechanical precision. I didn't say a word to anyone at my office. I just clocked out, walked to my car, and drove directly to the downtown office of Miriam Klein. Miriam was a highly aggressive, deeply feared estate and trust litigator in Boston. She didn't do family law. She didn't care about emotional reconciliations or mediating family disputes. She specialized in tearing apart corrupt fiduciaries and recovering stolen assets. She was a legal predator, and right now, I needed a predator. I sat across from Miriam's massive mahogany desk and placed the manila folder in front of her. My mother was the trustee for my daughter's medical fund, I stated, my voice cold and precise, entirely stripped of the paralyzing grief I had carried for 3 years. She withdrew $186,000, the exact week my daughter was dying from leukemia and needed a clinical trial. 2 days later, my brother bought a luxury house for cash. I want to know if I have a case. Miriam opened the folder. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the office was the sharp turning of pages, the hum of the city traffic outside her window, and the scratch of Miriam's expensive pen as she took meticulous notes. Finally, she closed the folder and looked at me. Her expression was entirely professional, but I could see the sharp, predatory gleam in her eyes. This is one of the most egregious, undeniable cases of breach of fiduciary duty I have ever seen in my career, Miriam said flatly, tapping the trust document. Your mother had a strict legal obligation to use these funds exclusively for Lila's benefit. Instead, she used them to enrich another family member. It is textbook financial fraud. It's essentially embezzlement. Can we sue her for the money? I asked. We can do much more than that, Selene, Miriam replied, leaning forward, resting her hands on the desk. Because we can directly trace the stolen trust funds to the purchase of a specific physical asset. Your brother's house on Sycamore Lane. We can ask the court to impose a constructive trust on the property. What does that mean? It means, Miriam smiled thinly, a smile entirely devoid of warmth, that the court will legally rule that Gavin does not actually own the house. The court will rule that the house belongs to Lila's trust because it was bought with Lila's stolen money. We can force the immediate mandatory sale of the property to recover the funds. Gavin will be evicted. I felt a sharp, vicious thrill run down my spine. I didn't just want my mother to pay. I wanted Gavin to lose the house he had happily accepted while his niece was dying in a hospice bed. I wanted him to feel the same absolute helplessness I had felt. There's one catch, however, Miriam noted, tapping the trust document with her pen. In order to file this specific type of aggressive litigation, you need legal standing. Since Lila has passed away, the only person who has the legal authority to sue the primary trustee on behalf of the trust is the designated successor trustee. Miriam flipped to the last page of the document I had provided. And according to this document, Miriam read, pointing to the text, your grandfather, Silas, specifically designated you, Selene Hawthorne, as the successor trustee in the event that Margot failed to execute her duties, became incapacitated, or was removed for cause. I stared at the page. I hadn't even noticed it in my initial blinding rage. My grandfather knew. He knew his daughter was toxic. He knew Margot favored Gavin over everyone else to a pathological degree. He had purposely installed a legal failsafe, trusting me to protect Lila's money if Margot tried to steal it. File the lawsuit, Miriam, I said quietly, a profound sense of purpose filling the hollow spaces in my chest. Take the house. Take everything. The legal strike was swift, brutal, and completely unexpected. 3 days later, Margot and Gavin were officially served by private process servers with a massive civil lawsuit alleging extreme breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and requesting the immediate imposition of a constructive trust on the Sycamore Lane property. The Hawthorne family's reaction was explosive. My phone blew up with furious, hysterical voicemails from my mother, my father, and Aunt Lorna. They called me crazy. They called me a bitter, grieving woman who was lashing out and trying to destroy her brother out of pure jealousy. They accused me of trying to extort them. They immediately hired an incredibly expensive, highly aggressive defense attorney from a white shoe law firm to fight the lawsuit. 2 weeks later, we met for the first preliminary hearing in the probate judge's chambers. Margot walked into the room wearing a tailored Chanel suit, looking incredibly indignant and deeply offended that she was even being questioned. Gavin walked in behind her, looking nervous but arrogant, clearly believing his mother and her expensive lawyer would protect his house. My father, Russell, trailed behind them, looking like a whipped dog. He wouldn't even look in my direction. Margot's highly paid defense attorney slammed a thick binder down on the heavy oak table. Your Honor, the defense attorney announced confidently, projecting a massive amount of legal authority. This entire lawsuit is completely frivolous and based on the malicious, grief-stricken delusions of an estranged daughter. Ms. Hawthorne has absolutely no legal standing to bring this suit. She is the designated successor trustee. Miriam countered smoothly, entirely unfazed by the bluster. She is not, the defense attorney replied, pulling a document from his binder and handing it to the judge. We have the original, notarized trust document from Margot Hawthorne's personal safe. There is no successor trustee clause. The trust reverted entirely to Margot's absolute discretion upon the minor's death. Miriam frowned, quickly scanning the document the defense had provided. I looked at it over her shoulder. It was identical to the trust I had found in the corporate files, except for one massive, glaring difference. The final page, the page detailing the successor trustee clause and bearing my grandfather's signature regarding that specific stipulation, was completely missing. The document had been carefully restapled to look complete. They had altered the trust document. They had destroyed the signature page to strip me of my standing. Furthermore, the defense attorney continued, pulling out a second, highly suspicious piece of paper. The withdrawal of $186 was not a breach of fiduciary duty. It was a fully authorized, interest-bearing family loan made to Gavin Hawthorne, backed by this legally binding promissory note signed by Gavin and witnessed by Russell Hawthorne. I stared at the promissory note. It looked completely fake. It looked like something they had drafted on a home computer 3 days ago to retroactively cover up the theft. The ink looked entirely fresh. A loan? The judge asked, raising a highly skeptical eyebrow, leaning over the bench. From a pediatric medical trust to buy a house for a healthy adult? Yes, Your Honor. The defense attorney lied smoothly. It was an investment designed to grow the trust's principal for the minor's future. Sadly, the minor passed away before the loan could mature. My clients acted completely within their legal rights and the bounds of the trust. We moved for immediate dismissal based on lack of standing. The judge looked at Miriam. Counselor, if your client's version of the trust document is missing the signature page, she does not have standing to sue as the successor. We need a continuance, Your Honor, Miriam requested, her voice tight, recognizing the ambush. The judge granted a 2-week continuance to allow us to authenticate the documents. We walked out of the chambers. Margot stopped in the hallway and turned to look at me. She had a cold, victorious smirk on her perfectly made-up face. You should really get therapy, Selene, Margot said loudly, ensuring everyone in the hallway heard her. It's pathetic that you're trying to steal your brother's home just because you're unhappy. Silas trusted me with that money, not you. I didn't argue with her. I just looked at my father, Russell, who immediately looked away, unable to meet my eyes. He had signed the fake promissory note. He had actively participated in the cover-up of my daughter's stolen medical fund. I went back to Miriam's office. I was furious, but I wasn't defeated. I am a financial claims specialist. I know how to find paper. They destroyed the original signature page, Miriam said, pacing the office, clearly frustrated. And they faked the promissory note. But without the original, unaltered trust document to prove you are the successor, we can't pierce their defense. It becomes a he said, she said regarding the missing page. The document I found was a digital scan in a corporate server, I said, my mind racing through my knowledge of estate archiving protocols. If my grandfather used that bank to execute the trust, he wouldn't have kept the sole original copy in Margot's personal safe. Silas was a paranoid, meticulous businessman. I immediately started tracing the digital metadata on the file I had found. I tracked the originating law firm that had drafted the document for Silas 5 years ago. The law firm had merged with a larger corporate entity, but their physical archival storage was still maintained at a highly secure, private bank vault downtown. The next morning, armed with my grandfather's death certificate and my own identification, I walked into the bank. I requested access to Silas Hawthorne's physical estate archives. Because I was a direct, named beneficiary in his general will, the bank manager granted me access to the private viewing room. A clerk brought out a massive, heavy iron lockbox. I opened the box. It smelled of old paper and dust. It was filled with old stock certificates, property deeds, and tax returns. I dug through the files, my hands shaking. At the very bottom of the box, in a sealed, thick manila envelope, I found it. The original wet ink master copy of the Lila Hawthorne Trust. I carefully pulled the document out and flipped to the last page. There it was, the successor trustee clause, clearly designating me as the absolute legal authority if Margot failed her duties. And right below the clause, in thick, undeniable blue ink, was my grandfather's signature, heavily notarized by a state official. They hadn't destroyed the master copy. They didn't even know it existed. But as I pulled the document out of the envelope, a small, handwritten letter fell onto the mahogany table. It was written on my grandfather's personal stationery. The envelope simply read, "For Selene." To be read if necessary, I slowly opened the letter. "My dearest Selene," my grandfather had written in his sharp, elegant cursive. "If you are reading this, it means my worst fears have come true, and Margot has failed you. I know how she treats you. I know how she favors Gavin. I set up this trust to ensure that Lila would always be protected, regardless of what your mother decided to do. I named Margot as the primary trustee, only because the law requires an older, established fiduciary, and I didn't want to burden you with the complex tax liabilities while you were working so hard to raise your beautiful daughter. But I named you the successor for a reason. Because I know you, Selene. I know you are the only person in this entire family who is actually strong enough to do the right thing. You are the only one who will fight for the truth. If they try to take what belongs to Lila, do not let them. Burn them to the ground. With all my love, Grandpa Silas." I sat in the quiet, sterile bank viewing room and read the letter 3 times. For the first time in 3 years, the dam completely broke. I didn't just cry. I sobbed. I wept with a profound, shattering grief, not just for Lila, but for myself. Because finally, someone in my family had seen me. My grandfather had seen exactly who I was and exactly who my mother was, and he had reached out from the grave to hand me the sword I needed. I wiped my tears, carefully placed the master document and the letter into my briefcase, and walked out of the bank. I didn't just have standing anymore. I had a mandate. When Miriam presented the authenticated, wet ink master document to the judge at the next hearing, the defense's entire case completely disintegrated. The judge looked at the faked, missing page document Margot's lawyer had submitted, and then looked at the verified master copy with my grandfather's notarized signature. The judge was absolutely furious. "Counselor," the judge warned Margot's highly paid attorney, his voice laced with judicial rage, "submitting altered, fraudulent documents to this court is perjury. If I find out your clients intentionally destroyed a signature page to hide their fiduciary breach, I won't just remove Margot as trustee. I will refer her to the district attorney for criminal fraud." Margot turned completely pale. Gavin looked like he was going to be sick. The judge didn't hesitate. He immediately ruled that the successor clause was legally valid, officially removing Margot Hawthorne as the trustee of the Lila Hawthorne Fund, and officially naming me as the sole legal authority. But the victory wasn't complete. I still had to prove that the $186,000 withdrawal wasn't a family loan, but a deliberate, malicious theft. I needed to prove that Gavin knew exactly where the money was coming from when he bought the house. I needed an inside witness, and that witness came from the most unexpected place possible. 2 nights after the hearing, my phone rang at 11 p.m. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. It was Paige Hawthorne, Gavin's wife. "Selene?" Paige whispered into the phone, her voice shaking violently. It sounded like she was hiding in a closet. "What do you want, Paige?" I asked coldly. I found the court documents," Paige stammered, crying quietly. Gavin left his briefcase in the kitchen. I read the lawsuit. I read the dates. Paige had always been slightly naive, deeply in love with the illusion of Gavin's success. She thought Gavin had earned the money for the house through a brilliant investment. "Did they really do it, Selene?" Paige asked, her voice cracking with absolute horror. "Did Margot really take the money from Lila's cancer fund to buy this house?" Am I living in a house bought with a dying little girl's money? Yes. Paige, I confirmed, completely uncompromising. Every single brick in your custom kitchen was bought with the money that was supposed to save my daughter's life. Paige let out a muffled sob. He lied to me, Paige wept. Gavin told me his parents just gave him an early inheritance advance. He swore to me it was clean money. Gavin is a liar, Paige, I said. He knew exactly what Margot did. He just didn't care. I have proof, Paige whispered, suddenly sounding incredibly determined, her moral compass overriding her loyalty to a corrupt husband. When we were buying the house, I asked Gavin why the wire transfer came from a different trust account, not Margot's primary checking. I thought it was weird. What did he say? I asked, sitting up straight. He texted me, Paige revealed. He texted me. Parents floated me the down payment. It's some trust thing for Lila, but Mom says she has full control of it. Don't ask questions. My heart slammed against my ribs. A text message from Gavin, explicitly acknowledging that he knew the money came from Lila's trust, and explicitly telling his wife not to ask questions to maintain plausible deniability. It was the smoking gun. It completely destroyed the promissory note loan defense, proving that Gavin was a fully complicit, knowing recipient of stolen fiduciary funds. Paige, I said, my voice urgent. I need screenshots of those texts. I need you to send them to me right now. If you do, I promise I will tell the judge you had absolutely no knowledge of the theft. Paige didn't hesitate. I'm sending them now. I'm packing my bag, Selene. I'm leaving him. I can't look at him anymore. I can't live in this house. 3 minutes later, my phone pinged with 5 high-resolution screenshots. The Hawthorne family thought they could steal my daughter's money and hide behind expensive lawyers and fake promissory notes. They didn't realize I now held the exact evidence required to legally annihilate them. The moment Paige filed for divorce and officially submitted the text message screenshots into the court record. As part of her sworn affidavit, the Hawthorne family panicked. They realized that their incredibly expensive legal defense, the fake promissory note, the claims of a family loan, the aggressive character assassination against me, was completely, undeniably destroyed. Gavin had confessed in writing that he knew the money came from Lila's trust. Desperate to avoid the massive, highly public legal and financial consequences, Margot initiated a brutal, highly coordinated family smear campaign. Aunt Lorna and my various cousins started blowing up my phone, flooding my inbox with deeply toxic, highly manipulative messages. They didn't apologize for the theft. They attacked me for destroying the family. They called me a bitter, vindictive woman who was using my daughter's tragic death as an excuse to steal my brother's house out of pure jealousy. They even attempted an intervention. I had foolishly agreed to stop by Aunt Lorna's house to pick up some old childhood photographs, only to walk into a living room ambush. Margot, Russell, Gavin, and several aunts and uncles were sitting in a circle, looking at me with a sickening mixture of pity and aggressive superiority. Selene, you have to drop this lawsuit. Aunt Lorna started immediately, using her most condescending maternal tone. Gavin is losing his wife. He's incredibly stressed. If you push this, he's going to lose his home. You're tearing this family apart over an accounting error. An accounting error? I asked, staring at her in absolute disbelief. They stole $186,000 from my dying 6-year-old daughter to buy a custom kitchen, Lorna. That's not an accounting error. That's a felony. It's just money, Selene. Margot snapped, standing up, her aristocratic patience completely gone. The money wasn't going to save her anyway. The doctors said the trial was experimental. She was going to die regardless. We just used the capital to secure a future for your brother. I felt a cold, paralyzing silence wash over the room. Margot had finally said it out loud. She had finally admitted the exact horrifying logic she had used to justify the theft. She had decided, playing God, that my daughter's life wasn't worth the investment, so she gave the money to her healthy, 32-year-old son instead. Before I could even react, a quiet, raspy voice spoke from the corner of the room. It was Great Aunt Mabel. She was 82 years old, the oldest living member of the Hawthorne family, and she rarely spoke at these gatherings. Mabel slowly stood up, leaning heavily on her cane. She didn't look at me. She looked directly at Margot. "You're a monster, Margot," Mabel said, her voice shaking with absolute disgust. The entire room gasped. Aunt Lorna tried to shush her, but Mabel slammed her cane against the hardwood floor, demanding silence. "Don't you dare shush me, Lorna," Mabel commanded, her eyes flashing with a fierce, ancient clarity. "I'm sick of the lies in this family. I'm sick of everyone protecting this spoiled boy." She pointed a trembling finger at Gavin. Mabel turned back to Margot. "Silas left that money for the little girl. We all knew it. We all knew what you did when you bought that house for Gavin. You took a dying baby's money, Margot. We all knew, and we all just looked away because we were too cowardly to fight you. Well, Silas knew you were a thief, and he knew Selene would stop you." Mabel turned to me. "Don't you stop, Selene. Don't you give them an inch. Burn that house to the ground." Mabel turned around and slowly walked out of the house, leaving the family intervention completely, utterly shattered. The next morning, realizing that the family manipulation tactics had failed and that Paige's text messages were going to legally annihilate them, Margot's defense attorney called Miriam with a desperate settlement offer. I sat in Miriam's office as she relayed the terms. "They are offering a one-time, immediate cash payment of $40,000, Miriam explained, looking at the legal document. "In exchange, you sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the trust, officially drop the lawsuit, and formally release the constructive trust claim against the Sycamore Lane property." $40,000? I asked quietly. "It's a nuisance fee," Miriam said flatly. "They're hoping you're exhausted. They're hoping the emotional toll of fighting your own family will make you take the quick cash and walk away, leaving Gavin with the house and the remaining $146,000 they stole." I looked out the window of Miriam's office. I was exhausted. The grief, the anger, the constant, suffocating toxicity of fighting my own mother was draining the life out of me. $40,000 was a lot of money. It would easily pay off the remaining medical debt I had incurred during Lila's hospice care. It would allow Ma to finally close this horrific chapter and move on. I almost said yes. I reached into my purse and pulled out my wallet. Folded carefully in the cash compartment was a small, slightly crumpled piece of paper. It was the last picture Lila had ever drawn. The crooked little house with the bright, sunshine yellow door. Yellow means you're allowed to come inside. I stared at the drawing. I thought about the pediatric oncology ward. I thought about the dozens of desperate, terrified parents I had met during those horrific 3 months. Parents who were currently selling their cars, maxing out their credit cards, and begging strangers on the internet, just like I had, to pay for experimental trials to save their children. If I took the $40,000, Margot won. Gavin won. The theft was validated. "Reject the settlement, Miriam," I said, my voice completely steady, a new, massive purpose solidifying in my chest. "I don't want $40,000. I want every single penny they stole from Lila. I want the house." Miriam smiled, a fierce, predatory grin. "I was hoping you'd say that. Let's go to court." Before the final hearing, I drove to the pediatric oncology ward at the Children's Hospital, where Lila had spent her final days. I didn't go into the rooms. I just sat in the waiting area. I watched a young woman, probably no older than 30, sitting in a plastic chair, quietly sobbing, while holding a massive stack of incredibly complex, deeply confusing hospital bills. I walked over to her and gently introduced myself. Her name was Rachel Moore. Her 5-year-old son, Noah, had just been diagnosed with a highly aggressive neuroblastoma. The doctors want to put him in a specialized targeted therapy trial. Rachel wept, completely overwhelmed. "But my insurance won't cover it because it's out of network. They want $160,000 up front. I don't have it. I work at a grocery store. He's going to die because I'm poor." I looked at Rachel. I saw myself, 3 years ago, sitting in that exact same chair, crying over the exact same horrifying financial math. "He's not going to die because you're poor, Rachel," I said quietly, squeezing her hand. "Just hold on a little longer. Help is coming." The final hearing in front of the probate judge was a completely one-sided massacre. armed with the verified master trust document proving I was the legal successor trustee, and armed with the sworn text messages from Paige proving Gavin knew the money was stolen. Miriam systematically dismantled the Hawthorne family's defense in less than 45 minutes. The judge didn't even pretend to hide his absolute visceral disgust. He looked at the timeline Miriam presented on a large display board. March 9. Margot withdraws $186,000 from the Lila Trust. March 11. Gavin buys Sycamore Lane for cash. May 14. Lila Hawthorne dies, having received $0 from the trust. The judge looked down from the bench, staring directly at Margot Hawthorne and her highly paid, entirely defeated lawyer. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice dripping with judicial contempt. "Is there any version of this reality, any conceivable, rational universe, where a trustee withdrawing the entirety of a dying child's as medical fund to purchase a luxury home for an able-bodied, 32-year-old adult is not a catastrophic breach of fiduciary duty?" The defense attorney literally didn't have an answer. He just lowered his head. "I didn't think so," the judge snapped. The judge slammed his gavel down. "I am officially removing Margot Hawthorne as the trustee of the Lila Hawthorne Trust, permanently and with profound prejudice." The judge ordered, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "I am formally recognizing Selene Hawthorne as the sole legal successor trustee, with full authority over all trust assets." The judge turned to Gavin, who was sweating profusely, staring at his shoes. Furthermore, the judge continued, delivering the final, fatal legal blow. "Because the stolen trust funds can be directly, undeniably traced to the purchase of the Sycamore Lane property, I am officially imposing a constructive trust upon the deed of that house." Margot gasped, covering her mouth. Gavin looked up, absolute panic in his eyes. "Mr. Hawthorne," the judge said, speaking directly to Gavin, "you do not own that house. You never did. The house belongs to the Lila Hawthorne Trust. You are hereby ordered to immediately vacate the premises. The property will be placed on the open market, sold, and every single penny of the proceeds will be returned to the trust. If there is a shortfall, I will authorize the garnishment of Margot Hawthorne's personal assets to make the trust whole." The hearing was over. We had won absolute, total victory. I walked out of the courthouse. I didn't gloat. I didn't stop to talk to Margot, who was hyperventilating in the hallway, or Gavin, who was screaming at his lawyer about losing his home. I got in my car and drove directly to the cemetery. I sat down on the cool grass next to Lila's headstone. "I got it back, baby," I whispered, resting my hand on the smooth granite. "I got your money back. I'm sorry it was too late to buy your yellow door. I'm so sorry." I took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. "But I'm not going to let them keep it," I promised her, "and I'm not going to keep it either. We're going to build a lot of yellow doors, Lila, for all the kids who are still waiting." The next week, I sat down with the legal directors of the hospital foundation. Using my authority as the sole successor trustee, I legally transferred the entire $214,000 balance of the recovered trust, plus the significant equity gained from the forced sale of Gavin's house, into a newly established, highly regulated philanthropic endowment. I named it the Lila Hawthorne Yellow Door Fund. The sole strict purpose of the fund was to provide immediate, no questions asked, anonymous financial grants to single mothers in the pediatric oncology ward who couldn't afford out-of-network clinical trials for their children. I didn't keep a single dime for myself. I didn't want the blood money. I wanted a legacy. While I was building the foundation, Gavin's life was rapidly, spectacularly imploding. Losing the house was the final straw for Paige. She finalized the divorce, taking full custody of their dog and leaving him with absolutely nothing. Gavin was forced to move back into my parents' sprawling estate, a 33-year-old unemployed failure living in his childhood bedroom, unable to cope with the massive public humiliation of the lawsuit, the loss of his wife, and the absolute destruction of his golden boy image. Gavin turned to alcohol. He didn't just drink casually. He drank with the desperate, aggressive intent of a man trying to completely erase his own reality. He drank heavily, every single day, for 2 straight years. Margot and Russell, entirely unable to hold him accountable, just watched him do it, continuing to enable him, hoping it was just a phase. It wasn't a phase, it was biological suicide. Which brings us back to the harsh fluorescent glow of the intensive care unit waiting room at 2 a.m. Gavin had collapsed in the kitchen of my parents' house, vomiting blood, his skin violently jaundiced. The years of incredibly heavy drinking, combined with a previously undiagnosed underlying liver condition, had triggered acute, catastrophic hepatic failure. He was rushed to the ICU. The doctors managed to stabilize him, but the prognosis was grim. His liver was completely, irreversibly destroyed. He needed a transplant immediately, but because his liver failure was directly tied to severe, recent alcohol abuse, he was placed at the absolute bottom of the National UNOS Organ Registry waitlist. The system does not prioritize active alcoholics for deceased donor organs when there are thousands of sober patients waiting. His only hope of survival was a directed living donor, someone willing to voluntarily undergo massive, highly invasive surgery to cut out a portion of their own healthy liver and give it to him. They tested Margot. She was too old, and her liver enzymes were incompatible. They tested Russell. He had high blood pressure and early-stage heart disease. He wouldn't survive the surgery. They tested me, using the medical records on file from when I had registered as a potential bone marrow donor for Lila years ago. I was a perfect, flawless genetic match. And that is why Margot Hawthorne was kneeling on the sterile linoleum floor of the hospital waiting room, weeping hysterically, begging me to save the life of the son she had prioritized over my daughter. "Please, Selene," Margot sobbed, clutching my coat. "If you don't do this, he's going to die. I know you're angry. I know what we did was wrong, but he's your brother. You can't just let him die." I looked down at her. "I'm sorry, Margot," I said quietly, the 3 words falling from my lips like lead weights. "Not my problem." Margot gasped, as if I had physically struck her across the face. She collapsed forward onto the floor, weeping hysterically, while I turned around and started to walk toward the elevator. But before I could reach the doors, a woman stepped out of a nearby office. She was wearing a white coat, her expression incredibly serious. "Ms. Hawthorne?" the woman asked. "I'm Renee Alvarez. I'm the clinical transplant coordinator for this unit. Before you leave, I need to speak with you and your parents in the private consult room. It's mandatory protocol." I stopped. I didn't owe my parents anything, but I respected the medical staff. I nodded and followed Renee into a small, brightly lit consultation room. Margot, still crying, scrambled up from the floor and followed us, dragging a completely silent, defeated Russell behind her. We sat down around a small circular table. Renee folded her hands, looking directly at me. She completely ignored Margot's histrionics. "Selene," Renee began, her voice calm and highly professional. "I want to be absolutely clear about the laws and ethics governing living organ donation. No one can force you to do this. The decision must be entirely voluntary, free of any emotional coercion, financial pressure, or familial guilt. If you say no, for any reason, that is the end of the discussion. We will simply tell your family you were not a viable candidate to protect your privacy." "She has to do it," Margot interrupted, slamming her hand on the table, her desperation quickly morphing back into her usual toxic entitlement. "He's her brother. You have to tell her. It's her duty." Rennie shot Margot a look of pure, unadulterated ice. "Mrs. Hawthorne, if you interrupt me again, or if you attempt to coerce this potential donor in my presence, I will have security remove you from this hospital permanently, and Gavin's case will be transferred to a different facility." Margot snapped her mouth shut, looking absolutely terrified. Renee turned back to me. "Selene, do you feel pressured to donate?" I looked at Renee. I looked at the incredible professionalism in her eyes, and then I looked across the table at my parents. "I don't feel pressured, Renee," I said calmly. "I feel disgusted." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. If my parents wanted to play the family card in front of the medical staff, I was going to ensure the medical staff knew exactly what kind of family they were dealing with. "Tell me, Margot," I asked, my voice dangerously soft, "if I go into surgery tomorrow and give Gavin half of my liver, where is he going to recover?" Margot blinked, confused by the question. He'll come home with us." "Why?" I pressed relentlessly. Why doesn't he go to his own house? Oh, right. Because he doesn't have a house anymore. Because the judge took it away. Rennie watched the exchange closely, recognizing the deep, incredibly toxic history unfolding in her consult room. Do you know why the judge took his house, Renee? I asked, turning to the transplant coordinator. 3 years ago, my 6-year-old daughter, Lila, was dying of leukemia in this exact hospital network. She needed an experimental trial. It cost $178,000. My parents had the money. Actually, my grandfather had explicitly left that exact amount of money in a medical trust specifically for my daughter. I looked back at Margot, refusing to let her look away. But my mother was the trustee, I continued, my voice rising in power and authority. And when I begged her for the money to save her granddaughter's life, she told me that Lila wasn't really family, and it wasn't her problem. The very next day, she illegally withdrew $186, zero from my dying daughter's trust fund, and she used it to buy Gavin a house in cash. Rennie's eyes widened slightly. As a medical professional who dealt with life and death every day, the sheer moral depravity of the theft clearly shocked her. They let my daughter die to buy a custom kitchen, I stated, the absolute horrifying truth echoing in the small room. We didn't know the trial would work. Margot screamed defensively, unable to handle the public exposure of her crimes. It was experimental. We were just trying to protect Gavin's future. And look at his future now, I countered coldly, pointing toward the ICU. His liver is failing because he drank himself to death after losing the house he bought with blood money. The house I took back from him, I turned to my father. Russell was staring at the floor, looking like a man who wanted the earth to swallow him whole. You signed the fake promissory note, Dad, I said quietly, the disappointment heavier than anger. You sat in that lawyer's office and tried to help her cover up the theft of your granddaughter's money. Why? Russell finally looked up. Tears were streaming down his weathered face. Because saying no to her was too hard, Russell whispered, a pathetic, broken confession. I'm so sorry. I was weak. He had let my daughter die because he was too cowardly to argue with his wife. You taught me exactly what this family does when someone it doesn't love needs saving, I said, addressing both of them, delivering the final, fatal psychological blow. You taught me that family is conditional. You taught me that money and real estate are more important than biology. I stood up from the table. I am not your emergency fund, I announced, my voice completely steady. I am not your spare parts drawer. I am not an organ bank you can withdraw from when the golden child finally destroys himself. Margot fell to her knees again, right there in the consult room. Please, Selene, she shrieked, grasping at the air, realizing she had absolutely no leverage, no power, and no control left. I'll do anything. I'll give you whatever you want. Please don't let him die. I looked down at her. I'm not letting him die, Margot, I corrected her softly. I'm just letting him wait. I turned to Renee Alvarez. The transplant coordinator was watching me with an expression of profound, quiet respect. She had seen countless families tear each other apart in this room, but she had never seen a reckoning quite like this. Mrs. Hawthorne, Renee asked formally, following the strict ethical protocol, are you willing to proceed with the living donor psychological and physical evaluation process? I looked at Renee. I looked at the ICU doors. That's a no, I said clearly and unequivocally. Put him on the list. Renee nodded, accepting the decision immediately. Understood. The consultation is over. Security will escort your parents out if they do not leave voluntarily. The list? Margot gasped, staring at me in absolute horror. He's at the bottom of the list. He won't survive the wait. Then I guess he'll have to hope for a miracle, I replied, opening the door to the consult room. Just like Lila did. I walked out of the hospital. I didn't look back. I didn't wait to see if Gavin survived the night. I walked out into the cool early morning air, got into my car, and drove away from the Hawthorne family forever. The aftermath of that night played out exactly as the medical statistics predicted. Gavin didn't die immediately. The doctors managed to stabilize his acute failure, but his quality of life plummeted. He was discharged to a long-term care facility, incredibly weak, constantly heavily medicated, waiting desperately for a deceased donor organ to become available. Because of his history of severe alcohol abuse, he remained incredibly low on the UNOS priority list. Margot and Russell spent every waking hour sitting by his bed in the care facility, watching their golden child slowly wither away, entirely helpless, knowing that they had actively destroyed the only bridge that could have saved him. They lived in a constant, agonizing state of purgatory, the exact same purgatory I had lived in while watching Lila fade away. But I didn't dwell on their misery. I had work to do. The week after I walked out of the hospital, the legal sale of the Sycamore Lane house officially closed. The property, bought with Lila's stolen trust money, sold for nearly $500,000 in a highly competitive real estate market. Every single penny of the proceeds, combined with the remaining balance of the trust, was immediately wired into the corporate accounts of the Lila Hawthorne Yellow Door Fund. I sat in my new, bright office at the hospital foundation, looking at the bank statement. We had over $600,000 in initial funding. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had saved weeks ago. "Hello?" An exhausted voice answered. "Rachel," I said, smiling warmly. "It's Selene Hawthorne. We met in the pediatric oncology waiting room a few weeks ago." "Oh, hi, Selene," Rachel said, sounding completely defeated. "I remember you. I'm sorry, we're at the hospital. Noah's numbers aren't good. The trial starts on Monday, but the insurance appeal was officially denied this morning. We don't have the $160,000. I don't know what I'm going to do." I could hear the absolute, crushing despair in her voice, the exact same despair I had felt on Margot's white couch. "You're not going to do anything, Rachel," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "I'm calling to tell you that the hospital finance department has just received a direct wire transfer from the Lila Hawthorne Yellow Door Fund." The line went completely silent. "What?" Rachel whispered, her breath catching. "The $160,000 is fully paid, Rachel," I confirmed, tears welling in my eyes, tears of absolute joy. "Noah is fully enrolled in the trial. The funds are cleared. You don't owe anyone a dime. Just focus on getting him better." Rachel broke down into heavy, uncontrollable sobs of pure, unadulterated relief. I could hear her dropping the phone, crying out to the nurses, telling them the money was there. That was our first grant. It wasn't our last. Over the next 2 years, the Yellow Door Fund aggressively expanded. We received massive corporate donations after a local news station picked up the story of our first 10 grants. We partnered with major pharmaceutical research boards. We became a powerful, highly efficient financial shield for desperate parents. Noah, Rachel's son, responded beautifully to the experimental targeted therapy. 8 months after the trial began, he officially went into total remission. To celebrate his recovery, Rachel brought Noah to my office. He was a bright, energetic little boy with a head full of curly hair. He ran into my office and handed me a folded piece of heavy construction paper. "Thank you, Miss Selene," Noah said shyly. I opened the card. Inside, drawn in bright, aggressive crayon, was a picture of a massive, slightly crooked hospital. And right in the front, coloring completely outside the lines, Noah had drawn a huge, sunshine yellow door. I looked at the drawing, and for the first time in years, I felt Lila smiling right next to me. I had framed Lila's original drawing, the one she had kept by her hospice bed, and hung it right behind my desk, perfectly at eye level for any child who walked into the office. My family had told me that Lila wasn't really one of theirs. They had treated her like a disposable inconvenience, stealing her future to buy a kitchen they would eventually lose. But they were wrong. Lila wasn't just a sick little girl. She was a legacy. Her name was currently etched onto the glass doors of a massive philanthropic foundation. Her stolen money had been recovered, weaponized, and transformed into a lifeline that was actively saving children across the state. My daughter didn't get to walk through her yellow door. She didn't get to grow up. But because of her, dozens of other children would. I sat at my desk, looking at Noah's drawing, feeling the warm sunlight streaming through my office window. I was Selene Hawthorne, I was whole, I was powerful, and I was completely, absolutely free. So, tell me honestly in the comments below, If your incredibly wealthy parents stole $186,000 from your dying 6-year-old daughter's medical trust to buy a luxury house for your unemployed brother, and then, 3 years later, your brother was dying of liver failure, and they begged you to be a living organ donor, would you forgive them, undergo massive surgery, to save a man who lived in a house bought with your child's blood money, and try to heal the family? Or would you aggressively sue them, legally force the sale of the house to recover the stolen money, start a pediatric charity in your daughter's name, and look your mother in the eye while you refuse to save her son? Let me know. I read every single one.